When mentioning one of the most renowned generals in Europe and the world, it is impossible not to mention Napoleon Bonaparte, a military genius whose brilliant campaigns are still studied by military scholars today. An entire era and a prolonged war were named after him, illustrating his immense influence in military history. From a small, humble background on the island of Corsica, Napoleon rose amidst the chaos of late 18th century France to establish his name and ultimately seize supreme power. He gained fame through his campaigns in Italy and Egypt, and eventually became the first consul, the most powerful man in post-revolutionary France. Napoleon was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, a town on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. He was the second son in a noble Tuscan family. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer of aristocratic lineage. The family had settled on Corsica since the 16th century, when it was still under Italian rule. Napoleon was born just 1 year after Corsica was ceded to France by the Republic of Genoa, making him a French citizen by birth. Yet, as he later remarked, "I was born when my country was dying," referring to France's decline at the time. After France took control of Corsica in 1768, many locals resisted under the leadership of Pascal Paoli. Napoleon's father initially joined the resistance but later cooperated with the French authorities after Paoli's defeat. Thanks to his father's noble background and connections, Napoleon had access to education uncommon for most Corsicans. In 1779, he enrolled in a religious school in Autumn to learn French and later entered a military academy in Brienne. His Italian-sounding name and Corsican accent made him the subject of ridicule, but he focused on his studies and excelled in mathematics, history, and geography. Though once thought to have potential as a sailor, he chose a military path. In 1784, Napoleon was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris to train as an artillery officer. When his father died in 1785, the family's finances became strained, and Napoleon rushed his studies, graduating a year early. He was then commissioned as a second lieutenant in the La Fère Artillery Regiment. Initially, he remained an ordinary officer, but the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 changed the course of his life. In 1789, he returned to Corsica to rally support for the revolutionary cause. By 1790, even Pascal Paoli had returned, aiming to push for Corsican independence once more. Corsica sought independence from France, but Paoli soon came into conflict with Napoleon. He believed that Napoleon's father had betrayed the Corsican cause by siding with the French. As a result, during his time in Corsica, Napoleon found himself caught in a complex three-way conflict between the royalists, the revolutionaries, and the nationalists. Despite the turmoil, Napoleon leaned toward the revolutionary faction, believing the revolution could rescue France from crisis. He supported the Jacobins and was appointed lieutenant colonel in the Corsican National Guard, eventually commanding a battalion of volunteers. Even though he overstayed his leave and led an uprising against the French army in Corsica, he was still promoted to captain in the regular French army. By July 1792, tensions between Napoleon and Paoli escalated. When Paoli's supporters seized control of Corsica, Napoleon decided to move his entire family to mainland France. By June 1793, the French Republic was in deep crisis. After King Louis XVI was executed on January 21, 1793, royalists proclaimed his son Louis XVI as king and launched a counter-revolution. Meanwhile, monarchies across Europe formed the first coalition to oppose the French Republic. Internal conflict also erupted between the Jacobins and the Girondins, leading to purges and the deaths of tens of thousands by guillotine. In August 1793, the port city of Toulon rebelled against the Republic. At the time, Toulon was France's largest and most important naval base in the south, hosting a third of its navy. Its capture and opening to British forces posed a grave threat to the Republic. The Republican army was ordered to retake Toulon at all costs. During the siege, thanks to the recommendation of fellow Corsican Antoine Christophe Salicetti, a member of the National Convention in Paris, Napoleon was appointed commander of the artillery regiment. Upon assuming command, Napoleon found his artillery force severely lacking in numbers, training, discipline, and supplies. Still, he set to work restoring old cannons, training infantry and artillery tactics, and establishing arms and ammunition workshops. He also requested over 100,000 sandbags from Marseille to fortify positions. As a result, Napoleon's artillery force grew to include 64 officers, around 1,500 troops, and more than 100 cannons, mortars, and howitzers. According to Napoleon's plan, capturing Fort La Guillette would allow him to shell the anchored ships of the Allied fleet, forcing the British Navy to abandon the port and weakening Toulon's defenses, thus paving the way for a French victory. On September 22nd, French forces launched an assault on the Muret redoubt, but despite their numbers, they were repelled. Over the next 48 hours, the British reinforced the redoubt, increased the garrison, and built a stronger fort named Fort Mulgrave with 20 cannons. French commander General Dugommier decided to give Napoleon full authority over the assault operations. It was a young officer who proposed the feasible plan to retake Toulon, and he was entrusted with this important mission. At the time, Napoleon had been promoted to the rank of major and immediately began working. He ordered the construction of additional artillery fortifications to launch a decisive assault. To boost morale when soldiers feared being in range of enemy cannons, he renamed the position the Fort of Fearless Soldiers, which significantly raised their spirits. The British could no longer easily repel the French. On November 30th, they tried to reverse the situation by destroying French forts, initially gaining the upper hand as French artillery was neutralized. However, reinforcements led by Dugommier and Napoleon arrived, launching a counterattack that pushed the British back. On the night of December 16th, 17, in heavy rain, Napoleon led a decisive assault on the Allied fort of Fort Mulgrave. Due to the weather, both sides fought mostly in close combat with bayonets and daggers. Despite being wounded in the thigh and having his horse shot, Napoleon led the charge and captured the fort, followed by two others, Fort La Guillette and Tour de la Balaguier. By the afternoon of the 17th, French forces installed 10 heavy cannons at Fort La Guillette, aimed at the Allied fleet. The British were forced to withdraw from Toulon, and the French Republic successfully reclaimed the city. Due to his achievements in the siege of Toulon, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general and came to the attention of Augustin Robespierre, brother of Maximilien Robespierre, the leader of the Jacobins. In February 1794, he was appointed commander of the artillery of the Army of Italy near the Italian border. He soon submitted a plan to attack the Kingdom of Sardinia in response to the First Coalition. The plan was approved, and by April 1794, the French army launched its campaign. After winning the Battle of Saorgio against the Austro-Sardinian coalition, French troops advanced northeast into Italy, capturing Ormea and other strategic points. Following the campaign, Napoleon was sent by Augustin Robespierre to the Republic of Genoa to assess its stance toward France. However, after the fall of the Jacobins and the execution of Maximilien Robespierre in July 1794, Napoleon was accused of associating with them and arrested on August 9th. He was held under house arrest for 2 weeks before being cleared of all charges. He continued serving in the Republican Army, with his talent proven through the siege of Toulon and the Sardinian campaign. He was ordered to draft a plan to invade Italy. In March 1795, Napoleon joined a French expedition to reclaim the island of Corsica from the British, which ultimately failed. In April of that year, he became engaged to Désirée Clary, the sister of his brother's wife and daughter of a wealthy merchant family in Marseille. Around this time, he was transferred to the Army of the West, which was fighting royalist rebels in the Vendée region in western central France. He was appointed infantry commander, a demotion from his previous artillery command, which he declined citing poor health. At one point, Napoleon even considered traveling to Istanbul to serve the Ottoman Empire, but this plan failed. On September 15, 1795, he was removed from the list of regular army generals for refusing an assignment and not joining the campaign in Vendée. During this time, Napoleon faced financial difficulties and a bleak future. However, fortune turned in his favor on October 3rd, when royalist factions in Paris rebelled after being excluded from the new government. Paul Barras, who knew of Napoleon's reputation from the siege of Toulon, entrusted him with defending the government headquarters at the Tuileries Palace. Napoleon immediately ordered a young cavalry officer, Joachim Murat, to retrieve heavy artillery and set up defensive lines. Without hesitation, Napoleon commanded the troops to fire on the royalist insurgents, turning the rebellion into a massacre with hundreds killed and the rest fleeing. This event, occurring on October 5th, became known as the 13 Vendémiaire Uprising. Napoleon's decisive action earned him the trust of the new government. He was promoted to Major General and appointed commander of the Army of the Interior. By early 1796, he was also given command of the Army of Italy. A few weeks after the uprising, Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais, the most famous woman in his life. Josephine was the widow of Viscount Alexandre de Beauharnais, who had been executed by the Republic in March 1794. She was later imprisoned and only released after the fall of Robespierre. Through her connections, she managed to recover her husband's confiscated assets, enabling her and her 2 children to live in relative comfort. According to Napoleon, they met after the government began confiscating weapons for security reasons, following the uprising. Josephine's son, Eugène, approached Napoleon to request the return of his father's sword, which Napoleon granted. The next day, Josephine came to thank him, and he immediately fell for her, despite her being 6 years his senior. He soon began visiting her home regularly. In early 1796, Napoleon proposed to Josephine, and they married on March 9th, shortly after he broke off his engagement to Désirée Clary. 2 days after the wedding, Napoleon left Paris to assume command of the Army of Italy, marking the beginning of his famed Italian campaign. By early 1796, the war between the French Republic and the First Coalition was in its 4th year. Although France had won key victories in the Rhineland and against Spain and Russia, Britain and Austria continued their assaults, demanding French withdrawal from the Netherlands and the Rhineland. France responded by deploying several armies, one in the northeast, another along the Rhine, and the third under Napoleon, tasked with confronting Austrian forces in Italy. Upon taking command, Napoleon found the Army of Italy in dire condition, thousands of soldiers suffering from hunger, lacking clothes and equipment, and facing a powerful enemy, the Austrian Empire and its Sardinian allies, who had blocked the narrow Ainthind corridor into Italy, flanked by the treacherous Alps. Both cavalry and artillery were severely lacking. Most of the subordinate generals were older than Napoleon, making it difficult for them to accept taking orders from a 27-year-old new commander. To address this, Napoleon first met with the generals to secure their loyalty. On March 28th, he gave a speech promising the troops they would have opportunities to plunder and seize wealth from Italy's wealthy cities, aiming to boost their morale and enthusiasm for marching and fighting. His strategy was to swiftly defeat the enemy and disrupt communication between the Austrian and Sardinian forces. He decided to focus on defeating the Sardinians before the Austrians could intervene. Between April 11 and 22, the French won 4 major battles, forcing the Sardinian army to retreat to Turin. On April 28th, the Sardinian king signed the Treaty of Paris, ceding the territories of Savoy and Nice to France, and allowing French troops free passage through his land. In just 1 month, and with only 6,000 casualties, Napoleon had decisively defeated the Sardinians, securing his flanks. Napoleon then advanced to Lodi, aiming to capture Lombardy in northern Italy. The Austrian general Beaulieu retreated across the only wooden bridge, setting up artillery to cover their withdrawal. Rather than charging immediately, Napoleon ordered a heavy artillery bombardment and sent cavalry upstream to flank the Austrians. Once the cavalry attacked, he ordered his infantry to cross the bridge and launch an assault. The Austrians were defeated, with 2,000 captured, though Beaulieu managed to retreat with most of his forces. After the victory at Lodi, Napoleon faced a political setback when the French government ordered him to split his army and give half to General Kellerman. While Napoleon was to move toward the Papal States, Kellerman would take the Po Valley. Napoleon strongly opposed this decision in a letter to the government. 5 days after the Lodi victory, Napoleon entered Milan, where only a small Austrian force held out in the Sforza castle. To appease him, the French government reaffirmed its full trust, and Kellerman later sent 10,000 reinforcements. On May 22, 1796, 5,000 French troops besieged the castle, while 30,000 others prepared to engage Beaulieu's forces near Lake Garda. Napoleon initially planned to break through Austrian lines at Borghetto by feinting an attack elsewhere, but unrest in Milan and Pavia forced him to return and restore order. Once resolved, he swiftly retook Borghetto on May 30th, pushing the Austrians back to the Adige River. Throughout June and July, Napoleon consolidated his forces and influence in northern and central Italy, while also laying siege to Mantua. In Annecy, response, the Austrians replaced Beaulieu with Field Marshal Wurmser, who led a three-pronged relief campaign. Kwasdanovich with 18,000 men from the west, Wurmser himself with 24,000 along the Adige, and a third force of 5,000 under Sabotendorf, from the east, aiming to flank the French. Their offensive began in late July, quickly capturing Salo and Brescia, dealing significant damage to the French. At this point, Napoleon was facing one of his greatest challenges. A single mistake could have led to catastrophic consequences for the more than 40,000 French troops far from home. Fortunately, the Austrian forces under Kwasdanovich were still separated by Lake Garda and unable to regroup. Seizing this opportunity, Napoleon decided to strike Kwasdanovich first. He defeated Wolfram's forces at the Battle of Lonato on August 3 and quickly turned to attack Wurmser's troops, who were attempting to relieve Mantua. Napoleon continued his success with a victory at Castiglione on August 5th, forcing Emperor Francis to retreat. Despite being outnumbered, the French maintained their siege of Mantua. However, due to heavy artillery losses, they could no longer assault the fortress directly. Nevertheless, Napoleon regained control of the Lombard plains. Though he lost 6,000 men, Austrian casualties reached nearly 17,000. The French government urged him to pursue Wurmser to end the campaign swiftly, but Napoleon hesitated. His troops were exhausted, Mantua was still holding out, and autumn was approaching, not ideal for a push into the Alps. Still, he divided his forces. 10,000 were left with General Sahuguet to continue the siege, while General Kilmaine defended along the Adige River. Napoleon, with about 33,000 men under Generals Masséna and Augereau, moved west to rendezvous with Vaubois near Lake Garda. Meanwhile, Austria prepared for another relief attempt in early September. General Davidovich led 14,000 men in the upper Adige Valley, aiming to attack the French frontally, while Wurmser circled behind to lift the siege. Austrian command believed the French couldn't react swiftly to this two-pronged assault, but once again, they underestimated Napoleon. He dispatched Vaubois with 10,000 men westward, while Masséna and Augereau led 23,000 troops into the upper Adige Valley. The French crushed Davidovich's army at Rovereto on September 4th, inflicting over 6,000 casualties and capturing 4,000. Vaubois stayed behind to monitor the remnants, while Napoleon pursued Wurmser, severing his supply lines. Augereau defeated Austrian rearguards at Primolano. Then the French ambushed Wurmser at Bassano on September 8th, capturing another 6,000 Austrians. Instead of retreating east, Wurmser gambled on reaching Mantua. Napoleon pursued him relentlessly. Despite the chase, Wurmser managed to enter Mantua, now crowded with nearly 30,000 Austrian troops, many of them wounded or ill. In just 6 weeks, a staggering 4,000 people died from untreated wounds and rampant disease. Outside the city, the Austrian army tightened its siege, and harsh weather conditions combined with a shortage of essential supplies worsened the situation. 2 consecutive failed French attempts to break the siege at Mantua boosted Austrian morale. With the French temporarily trapped inside the city, Napoleon's army had a chance to rest. However, there remained a pressing concern that Austria might send reinforcements, while the French had virtually no backup forces. Napoleon attempted to negotiate with the Italians to avoid a southern attack. In early November 1796, After defeating the French at the Rhine, Austria was finally free to retaliate. In the south, General Joseph Alvinci led 46,000 troops toward Italy to coordinate with Austrian forces at Mantua and Davidovich's reinforced division, aiming to trap and crush the French. To deceive Napoleon, they made it appear as if Alvinci's army was the real threat, hoping he would ignore Davidovich's northern offensive. But upon hearing of defeats at Trento and Rovereto, Napoleon quickly ordered Massena and Vaubois to block Davidovich while he turned to face Alvinci. Taking advantage of the Austrians' fatigue from the weather, Napoleon split his forces to attack at Polpenadze and Bassano. However, strong Austrian resistance at Bassano forced the French to retreat with heavy losses. On November 12th, Napoleon attacked again at Caldiero, but suffered another defeat. After a series of losses, Napoleon considered a full retreat. Fortune, however, favored him when the Austrians failed to pursue their advantage. Seizing the opportunity, he left 3,000 troops to guard Verona against Alvinci's vanguard, rallied all remaining forces from Vaubois and Kilmaine, and split them into 2 columns to launch a flanking attack. After 3 days of intense fighting at Arcole, 15-17 November, the French emerged victorious, forcing the Austrians to retreat eastward with slightly heavier losses. Meanwhile, on Nîmes, the same day, Davidovich defeated Vaubois at Rivoli. Upon hearing this, Napoleon quickly returned north, forcing Davidovich to retreat. Learning of this, Alvinci also ordered a withdrawal and halted his advance at Bassano. On November 23rd, Wurmser attempted to break out of Mantua, but suffered 800 casualties and captured only 200 French soldiers. He also received news of Davidovich's retreat, leaving him no choice but to return to Mantua. The Austrians' third breakout attempt had failed. In early 1797, the Austrians made one last effort to relieve Mantua. Alvinci still commanded 28,000 troops, a formidable force. Napoleon sent reinforcements to General Joubert, defending Rivoli. Despite shortages in equipment, limited manpower, and no path for retreat, Napoleon remained calm and launched a counteroffensive. While holding the front lines, the French infantry and cavalry struck at the Austrians from the rear, crushing their morale and repelling the attack decisively. Napoleon shifted his focus to the Austrian forces ahead, and within days, he decisively defeated them at the Battle of Rivoli, inflicting 4,000 casualties and capturing 8,000 prisoners. This crushed any hope of the Austrians relieving Mantua. Despite this, General Wurmser held out in Mantua for 2 more weeks before surrendering on February 2, 1797. Napoleon then planned to march directly into Austria, forcing them to urgently reinforce Vienna. By March, he had won another major victory, at the Battle of Tarvis, compelling Austria to agree to peace. On April 18th, France and Austria signed the Treaty of Leoben, ending the War of the First Coalition. France gained control over most of northern Italy and lands along the Rhine, while Austria took control of Venice. The Italian campaign was a decisive French victory and greatly elevated Napoleon's reputation. Once a promising young general, Napoleon now stood among the most powerful figures in France. Many of his subordinates also proved themselves in battle and would become key figures in building his future empire. By late 1797, nearly all European powers had made peace with France, except for Britain, France's age-old enemy. A dominant naval and commercial power, Britain remained determined to oppose France. In response, Napoleon proposed an expedition to Egypt to undermine British sea power and disrupt their trade routes to India. He assured the French government that once Egypt was conquered, he would form alliances with Indian princes to launch joint attacks against British colonies. Napoleon likely also saw himself following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. His plan was approved, as France too was eager to expand its presence in the Middle East. In May 1798, Napoleon led 38,000 soldiers of the Armée d'Orient on the Egyptian campaign, accompanied by 167 scientists from various fields to study and explore the region. On June 9th, he arrived in Malta, then under the control of the Knights Hospitaller. With many French knights unwilling to fight their countrymen, Grand Master Vaughan Hompesch could only mount weak resistance and soon surrendered. Napoleon captured this key naval base with only 3 casualties. To avoid clashing with the British Navy at sea, Napoleon's fleet arrived at Alexandria on July 1st. He quickly ordered a landing and attacked local garrisons, securing control of the city overnight. Advancing toward Cairo, his forces clashed on July 10th with around 3,000 Mamluk troops armed with British weapons. Despite fatigue from long marches, Napoleon successfully defended his flank and routed the enemy. He was so impressed by the Mamluks' combat skills that he later recruited many into his own forces. By July 20th, soldiers of the Army of the Orient had arrived east of Cairo and could see the massive pyramids in the distance. That evening, Napoleon received news that 6,000 Mamluk cavalry and around 10,000 local infantry were preparing to attack. Although the French army numbered 25,000, it only had 3,000 cavalry. However, their infantry was far superior in training and discipline, and they had a significant artillery advantage. Napoleon organized his forces into 5 square formations, placing cavalry and supplies in the center with artillery at the corners, and began a slow advance. To motivate his troops, Napoleon declared, "Soldiers, you are advancing into a land to liberate its people from savagery, to bring civilization to the east, and to free this beautiful territory from British hands. From the top of those pyramids, 40 centuries are watching you." The battle commenced, and the French formations forced the Mamluk cavalry to split. With superior firepower and discipline, the French crushed the enemy on the right and drove the left-wing cavalry into the Nile. The battle ended swiftly with a decisive French victory. Only 29 French soldiers were killed and 260 wounded, while the enemy lost thousands of cavalry and most of its infantry. 3 days later, the French entered Cairo with minimal resistance. However, things were not going well at sea. On August 1, the French fleet anchored at Aboukir Bay was destroyed by Admiral Nelson's British fleet. Napoleon's hopes of strengthening French dominance in the Mediterranean were shattered. In response, Britain formed the Second Coalition, allying with the Ottoman Empire, Russia, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Kingdom of Naples, declaring war on France in September 1798. Napoleon marched into Syria in early 1799, but met fierce resistance. His army, weakened by disease and supply shortages, was forced to retreat to Egypt in May. In July, a large Ottoman force led by Mustafa Pasha landed near Aboukir to expel the French. Knowing cavalry alone could not break the French squares, Mustafa set up coastal defenses. Napoleon saw their flaw. Once the line was broken, the Ottomans would have no escape route. The French attacked and broke the first line before it was completed, but were stalled at the second line. At that moment, French cavalry commander Murat saw an opportunity, led a charge straight through Ottoman lines, and stormed into Mustafa's command tent, cutting off 2 of his fingers and capturing him despite being wounded himself. The Ottoman army panicked and collapsed. Thousands drowned trying to swim to British ships offshore, while others fled to the fortress of Aboukir, only to surrender shortly after. The battle ended in a crushing Ottoman defeat, with thousands killed and over 200 French casualties. Despite these victories, France's position in Europe worsened. The French had lost many of the territories gained after the First Coalition War. Domestic unrest also grew. On June 18, 1799, extremist members of the French Directory staged a coup, removing the more moderate faction from power. One of the members of the council, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, believed that only a military dictatorship could save France from its current chaos and prevent the return of the monarchy. Although Napoleon was still in Egypt, he remained informed of major developments and decided to return to France, despite receiving no direct orders from the council. On August 24th, taking advantage of the temporary withdrawal of British ships, he set sail back to France with a small group of loyal followers, leaving the Army of the East in Egypt under General Jean-Baptiste Kleber's command. Upon his return, Napoleon was welcomed as a hero by the public due to his string of military victories. At the time, the Republic was severely weakened. and the council had lost the people's support. Sieyès quickly approached Napoleon, seeking his help in orchestrating a coup d'état to overthrow the Directory. Napoleon's brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who was the Speaker of the Council of 500, the lower house, was also involved in the plan. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon was assigned to ensure the security of both legislative chambers. Rumors had been spread by the plotters that extremist Jacobins were planning an uprising, which led the legislators to relocate their meeting to the Château de Saint-Cloud, west of Paris-Saint area, surrounded by troops loyal to Napoleon. The conditions favored a successful coup. Napoleon dissolved the Directory and established a smaller, more centralized government. He appointed himself, Sieyès, and Roger Ducos as provisional consuls, with Napoleon taking the position of first consul, quickly outshining the others, to become the most powerful figure in the French government. At the age of 30, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man from the remote island of Corsica, had risen to become the most powerful person in France, a general with absolute authority. Yet, he faced a nation still plagued by internal disorder and external threats from the formidable armies of European powers. How would Napoleon confront these adversaries? What great achievements would he accomplish to become Emperor of France? These questions will be explored in the next video about Napoleon Bonaparte.